I'm Jonathan Larsen with TRT Investigates, and I'm joined today by Anoa Changa, a reporter and organizer who has lived and worked in Georgia for more than 6 years. And I've known Anoa a little bit for a few years, and we kind of kept in touch on Twitter throughout the Ossoff and Warnock races. And I didn't pay as much attention as I should have to the work she was doing, but I always valued her insights and tried to stay on top when I saw her on Twitter. So now that the dust has sort of cleared, Anoa, I wanted to talk to you about the race, and I'm glad you could join me, and thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you in real time instead of just the rapid fire exchanges sometimes in the DMs.
That's right. So as I mentioned before I hit record, I sort of feel like I can't start without sort of giving you a chance to address the elephant in the room, literally the Republican Party elephant in the room of the chamber of the House of Representatives. And you know, this was a sort of mini 9/11, I think, in some respects. It was literally, as I pointed out, the fourth unhit target from 9/11. Finally, 20 years after bin Laden, terrorists got to it. And everyone, I think, is going to have a different perspective on what happened yesterday, but your perspective, I'm guessing, both as a Black woman and as someone who's been on the activist side rather than only the reporting side, you've done both. I'm very curious to hear what your thoughts were as it went down yesterday and with the passage of 24 hours.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question and opportunity to have this conversation. I just thinking and just reflecting on yesterday and talking with my children and my family and other colleagues, it was wild, for lack of a better phrasing. I don't really know how to describe it. And then I woke up this morning and I started reading some of the reflections from world leaders and other folks, and it was just like, they really did it. It's a culmination of so much, right? We've had a massive disinformation campaign, not just during this election cycle, not just even thinking about the attacks on like the pandemic, the vaccine, but there has been the last several years, we've seen a ramping up of disinformation across the political spectrum, but in particular in engaging a certain segment politically, right? And just really getting people more emboldened about their right and access to certain aspects of the government and not really understanding foundational principles of democracy. And I think about this like as a journalist, as someone who organizes, as, you know, just a mild-mannered mama, there's a real, I think, value that we're all taught, you know, growing up, that we're supposed to uphold the Constitution. Like, these are things that are principles that are drilled into us. You have an 8th grade civics class that you have to take. But somehow there is a segment of our country that we're taught that we're supposed to empathize with, that we need to unite with. I don't know how to unite with what happened yesterday. I know that if myself or any other group of non-white, right-leaning folks did what happened yesterday, one, I don't think many of us or any of us would have even made it as far into the Capitol as what we saw. And people have pointed out, you know, the response of Capitol Police and DC Police to Black Lives Matter protesters over the summertime and other actions in other places. I mean, just here in Atlanta, we actually had militia in the state capitol yesterday from reports. And meanwhile, we had 20 or so people arrested at a Jacob Blake solidarity protests in, you know, dealing with the wake of Jacob Blake's, the officers that shot Jacob Blake not facing any charges or firing or any disciplinary action. So all of this is weighing really heavy as we're thinking about what's happening right now. And just the one thing that really struck out for me yesterday as someone who has stepped into this role in terms of journalism was the complicit nature in some ways of some of our media counterparts. Because even though we ultimately have media, I would say, more correctly responding to what happened or covering what happened, initially you have media, social media, just playing Trump's message to his base, to his supporters, unchecked. I was driving in a car listening to NPR with a friend of mine, and we both just looked at each other at the red light. We're like, wait a minute, are they playing this without, and you hear the person on the air saying, wait a minute, how long is this? Wait, what is he saying? It's like, did you all not screen this? And so There is a collective responsibility, I think, to some extent into how we got here. And, you know, some of the folks in Congress were alluding to that in their different comments yesterday. But I also think that there has been this false sense of decorum and this need to be comfortable and just hurry up and rush past these moments that we never actually deal with things like this. And I don't know that we've actually had a moment like this in modern history where we have a critical mass of people really like challenging government in this way, and not challenging government to do better or make life better for folks, but challenging government because they simply don't like the outcome of a thing. And a lot of us are taught that we might not like the outcome, but if the process is fair, then you accept the outcome and you work harder the next time. And this is just a level of entitlement that I know that many of us try to make sure that even our toddlers do not have. So to see this on full display with some people who, you know, in some cases are armed is very frightening and thinking about how we move forward. But I really do think, like with media, we have a duty to not worry about making sure we're being fair to people on both sides. I don't even know how this is a thing that you can both sides. When you see, we have consistently had the Republican Party since the end of this election, and in some instances prior to the election itself, inflaming this type of rhetoric, right? Inflaming and emboldening. And you're literally telling people that, you know, Democrats or the left or whomever are stealing an election from them, right? I mean, the language that is being used, language matters. And we're seeing that in real time.
You know, I was struck by a few things which I haven't seen a lot of people talk about. One was, and I'm curious to get your reaction. One was that I had CNN on the air most of yesterday, and I don't mean to pick on them. I'm guessing this happened elsewhere as well. But one thing that struck me was the media commentators and politicians, even those who were clearly openly critical of Donald Trump, at the point where it became clear that people were breaking the law, what they were saying to the lawbreakers, the mob, the message was, go home, people, go home, get out of there. You don't belong there, go home. And the first thing that jumped to my mind was, these people have broken the law on national television, and go home means escape, get away with it. And it's a standard, and these were people who were critical. They opposed the demonstration, right? They were openly sharing their feelings, but even they were saying go home, which means get away with it. And I've seen a lot of the left respond by saying, you know, the police should have been much more confrontational and aggressive and things along those lines. I'm sure you've seen that as well. And they point to Black Lives Matter and the treatment that peaceful protesters with valid grievances have received. And to me, the concern is that the response on the left is often that when confronting right-wing Republican mobs, the police should be just as brutal and aggressive as they are with peaceful Black mobs, peaceful Black protesters. And to me, I guess the dilemma is, shouldn't the idea be more that when police are confronted with or come upon peaceful Black protesters, they should be just as nonviolent and non-aggressive as they are with white people, right? We want the ratchet to change on that end of things, don't we? Rather than on saying we need more police brutality and aggression rather than less. But how do you call for that without appearing to be sympathetic to the white criminals, violent criminals, who are being treated in a way that peaceful, law-abiding Black protesters are not?
Yeah, I think you have a really good point that's being raised. And I think that is the first initial knee-jerk reaction to what we're seeing, right? You know, we're used to seeing things a certain way. I've seen people reference, there's a picture of an officer helping someone walk down the stairs, and people were referencing, it was either in Buffalo or Syracuse, where the officers basically knocked down an elderly man and he had, a head wound. And, comparing these things well, you did this here. So you're absolutely right. We're not advocating for more state repression just because, or to have the police actively brutalizing people because that's what they do to other folks. The idea is, and this is not, for me, this is something that a lot of very learned, amazing people have been, trying to push through this discourse. I think a lawyer, Derica Purnell, had this commentary actually in a Guardian piece that I believe she had up this morning. And just that same thing that you're talking about, like the idea is that we don't want police brutalizing anyone, even people we don't like. Ultimately, because, it's the same thing when we're advocating for, healthcare for all or whatever the other issue is. Like, we want people to be treated with dignity and respect regardless, even the people that we can't stand, because that's what human beings are entitled to, right? And I think what you're saying is absolutely right. The other thing I would note is something a friend of mine, Tracy Corder, said. She is an organizer with Acre, and one of the things that she said was like, we've had all this talk about defund the police. It's a bad slogan, oh my God, slogan, you need to better marketing. And yet we have very clearly, I think Tracy laid it out perfectly and was like, the issue here is that, the police know when to de-escalate. They don't need more training. They clearly know how not to escalate situations. We've seen that, right? The police know when to show restraint. We've seen this now. I mean, we've seen it, unfortunately, in, Kenosha, in the aftermath with the way the shooter who killed 2 people on the streets of Kenosha was handled by officers. I mean, we've seen so many
Dylan
different
Roof.
Yes, Dylan Roof, exactly. We've seen so many instances and occurrences of even the way when people were trying to storm into the Capitol in Michigan earlier this year and threaten the governor and the Secretary of State. We've seen how people have been handled in certain instances. So what we're saying is, because you do have the capacity to handle people, or what many of these other amazing organizers are saying is, because you do have the capacity to handle people with a certain level of dignity and respect, we need you to do that consistently across the board. And quite frankly, this actually really shows us why we don't need the police, or you at least don't need these bloated budgets you have that require all these other things. And no, training is not the answer, because obviously you can do it. So I think what you're saying is absolutely right. Like, it is a lot of tension, a lot of emotions are flying high right now, rightfully so. It's very frustrating, but we all know that. I mean, I just think back to the J20 protests back in 2017, and having been just minutes from being a part of the kettling that happened myself, like, there was a lot happening in the streets of DC back during inauguration weekend in 2017. However, nothing got to this level of what we saw, and just the presence and the sheer force. I mean, everyone knew that was going to happen, just like this. Everyone knew that was going to happen. Everyone knew people were going to take the streets. So, you have tanks in the streets. You have a National Guard out. It was full force and ready to take action. The DC police kettling people. Like, we've seen what happens, and this idea that somehow the police and the Guard and other stuff were unprepared. They could not expect this. I mean,
the Capitol Police put out a statement today saying something very much along the lines of what you're saying. Like, we were told this was going to be a rally. Well, you were told all those other events were going to be peaceful marches, and you still showed up like it was, the taking of Paris.
Absolutely. And so I think that is, where we start the challenge. But we're seeing a lot of the facade of decorum and respectability and polite society really fade away right now, because it's like, it's not a matter, like you were saying, of we need them to be more brutal because they're brutal to everyone else. We need people to be treated with human dignity and respect, but we also need to have consistency in how we're approaching and addressing what is happening with certain actors on the right, instead of saying like, oh, we gave them the benefit of the doubt and this is what happened. We have been shown time and time again what these actions are really going to be. It's not simply a rally. I mean, they've been very clear about they're going to disrupt and did not want this election to be certified, as if that was actually going to stop something. I mean, and then we've seen members of members of
schedule
Congress.
the rally in Sheboygan.
Right. I mean, and then there were actions that took place. Like we here in Georgia, we had actual, white nationalists walking around the Capitol looking for the Secretary of State. They weren't looking to have a conversation with him.
Right.
Like, if anyone's grown up, like if you grow up in a regular neighborhood anywhere in this country, if someone shows up telling someone, I'm looking for so-and-so, it's not to have a nice conversation and maybe share a root beer. It's about to be a fight or something else. And so these are very real concerns, and we can't just keep saying like, oh, we just need to be united. We just need to brush this all aside. We've heard this before, and it just does not work.
So we get in the discussion around the rhetoric that got us here, and the debate about what kind of rhetoric gets us away from here. Right? There's a lot of critiquing from left and right about the way Biden talks about this stuff. I'm always fascinated by the people who are on the ground, because all the theories about what we should do and what we have to honor in our speech and what we have to signify in our speech, all of that kind of has to melt away when you're faced with an actual human person who you have to win over, you, Anoa, as an organizer. And so so that's my clumsy segue to Georgia, where, as I mentioned, you've done organizing work as well as being a reporter within the past year, and so I guess I'm a little curious about a few things about your organizing work. One is the sort of classic dilemma, which I don't think has to be a choice between one of two, but I'm curious to what extent the organizing efforts in Georgia reflected this split, the division between win over people who voted for Trump or whatever, or voted for Loeffler or Perdue, or activate people who are not engaged because they don't have faith in the ability of the political system, or at least the people within it, to deliver meaningful benefits to their lives. So I'm curious, on the ground in Georgia, which, if not both of those approaches, sort of predominates and why?
So one thing that I don't think folks really are aware that happened here is there was actually an organizing effort led by Surge, so Standing Up for Racial Justice, which is a white progressive organization that tries to organize and be anti-racist. And they actually did something that was, I think, loosely called the Collect Your Cousins Project. And it was, white organizers, white volunteers talking to white voters in Georgia about, racial justice type issues as a part of their IDing and their outreach program. So that was something that folks were actively, trying to talk to people about the issues and make sure that, at least people are aware of the options. Right. So I think when we talk about whether or not there's, and I start off with that only because we have this conversation about we got to go win over the Trump supporters. Right. This is literally something that people have been saying since the election in 2016.
Yeah.
However, that approach, people think, and we saw Claire McCaskill clumsily try to do this in her election and lose. And there are other examples, but the idea that you have to try to appease to what you think is the reason why people are voting a certain way, instead of meeting people where they are, as folks say, and then addressing the means and conditions of their actual daily lives, right? So when we talk about here in Georgia, what people did, I mean, when you're trying to decide, particularly when we're talking about this runoff period, right? Like the 8 weeks that we had for this runoff, when you're trying to decide where do you invest, where do you spend time, the bulk of the organizing looked at like, how do we bring new people into the fold? Because we know there are X amount of people who are registered.
Not trying to win over.
Not trying to specific. So I'm getting there. So like, when we know that we have, no, seriously, I'm getting there. I'm bringing it together. So we know that we have a certain population of people who are registered or eligible to vote that did not vote before, right? Like, so we know that we have traditional voters, the folks who are going to show up no matter what. We know those. We don't want to take those people for granted, but we know we have those people. Then we know that there are all these other people, Mondale Robinson with Black Male Voter Project, looked at Black men who had voted for Obama, but had not voted since like 2012 or 2016 or whatever, right? You had other organizations that look at people who have been registered or have been purged and re-registered, but did not vote in the midterm election. So these are voters we know that we can bring back into the process who are probably more value aligned with the candidates we're talking to. So then when we're looking at some of these other communities and areas, to your question about, are we spending time trying to persuade Trump supporters to not be Trump supporters? I mean, people who believe in, these conspiracy theories and some of this rhetoric, unfortunately, there may or may not be anything that any of us can do to convince them to think otherwise. right? But I do think that part of the messaging, and when you look at some of the messaging that was coming out of, the candidates' campaigns, at least, they were very clear about, what was differentiating between them and their opponents, as well as like the issues, right? And what they were trying to do for everyone. And I think for some people that may resonate. But I really think we're talking about like, how do we persuade people to come along with us? It's really centering, people, and they talk about this like I think it's like the race class narrative talks about like, how do we reach a broader range of people to bring them together for our coalition without throwing other folks under the bus, right? Because when you see, I mean, this happened in 2016, this happened some in this election cycle too, with Biden trying to appease to Republicans, or the rumors that he would have Republicans in his administration. Hillary Clinton had Republican outreach as well. The concern is when people are trying to appeal to Republicans just without any real like cognizant effort around their coalition building, that it will unfortunately throw some of us under the bus, right? But what we're seeing, and one thing that I appreciate from the race class narrative, which is a narrative framework that was developed specifically for this purpose, like how do we create broad, multiracial, diverse coalitions of people and bring them on board when we're talking about trying to win on various issues or push campaigns forward. So what I found really interesting from this, and what I've seen actually happening here on the ground, is that when people are talking about the issues, we're talking in rural communities about the hospital closures. Georgia in the last several years has had at least 9 hospital closures in rural areas. Georgia is also a place that has has the highest rate or one of the highest rates of Black maternal mortality. It's high in maternal mortality generally, as well as infant mortality. We have half of the counties do not have OBGYNs here. So these are very real critical issues. But when you start talking to folks about like their health concerns, when you start talking to people about like issues around jobs, the unemployment system, when we're seeing, a backlog in most of the states in the country have a backlog in the unemployment processing, which actually doesn't even meet the standards set by the Department of Labor. Like these are things that people are really feeling, right? And so when we're looking at like, how do we convert voters? How do we push people forward? We may or may not be able to move people, off of where they're standing and what they're focusing on. However, we may at least be able to explain to folks like some of these issues and how a particular candidate is going to, address certain things going forward. So it was really interesting watching this campaign or these campaigns unfold, whether it was the actual candidate campaigns, the coordinated campaign with the party, or the grassroots efforts that happen. And I think the grassroots efforts in particular with organizations like the New Georgia Project, Mahente, there was a lot more focus on communities of color just because of the huge increase in voter participation over the past few years, as well as really getting into rural areas and helping to activate and bring people on board. I mean, we've seen just with the runoff election that we had real turnout in rural areas by Black voters and other voters of color in ways that help redefine how we think about some of these communities. So I think when we're trying to approach organizing and thinking about, do we spend time trying to persuade people that someone is so bad for them, or do we try to build the winning coalition we know, and we're going to bring together these issues that will benefit everyone? I mean, I think folks will choose what makes the most sense in their investment, not saying that they won't talk to other people at all. And I think we need to stop thinking about it in those two extremes, right? Either we're trying to win people over or we're not talking to them at all. I think, people do approach trying to talk to people, who want to hear, right? Who are willing to be open. Because that's the other thing, right? We can try and talk to people and trace people all we want to, but if they're not open to listening, if they're not open to considering, I mean, that's a waste of time and resources. And you have these other communities that need, the time and attention. So it's a decision point, but you can definitely see it in the way some of the commercials and the programming has happened, when you think about some of the ad buys. But I think about the organizing that the New Georgia Project, that Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Common Cause, and other folks have really done, has been about sticking to the issues, what's at stake here for Georgians, Republicans. I mean, we are a state that still has not expanded Medicaid, even though the ACA is riddled with its own issues. You know, having people who want to do away with it without an effective replacement is a huge, it's not just simply a problem, it could be a death sentence for some of us. And then we also, like I said, we have the issues with the rural hospital closure. So these were issues that are felt, these are things that are widely supported to be addressed by multiple people. And so that's what folks have really been, I think, digging in on here, and just trying to make those connections and help people see the connection between this issue and who we're electing.
Did the ACA prove useful as a conversion tactic, either for people who were opposed politically beforehand or who were disengaged, being able to spell out, here are the specific consequences of not having a viable replacement for the ACA?
I think people understand, particularly those who have no health insurance, but also people who have struggled. I mean, because having health insurance is one thing, right? But being able to actually use that health insurance, but if you don't have the medical providers, if you can't afford to pay the co-pays
Copay, yeah.
well, I mean, the copay, but then the co-insurance, because that's another thing, right? Because you have your co-insurance, you have your copay, you have your
Premiums,
payment, but then you also have your out-of-pocket limits and all that other. So I think having people understand these issues, people also understand like having, you know, a commitment to addressing those issues. So I know folks want more specifics than just, yes, I'll deal with that. But unfortunately, when you're being held hostage in a system where we have people who are just like, well, we're going to get rid of these things. So first, prime example that just happened here right ahead of our election, I think in like the end of September, October, our governor moved to get a waiver to leave the exchanges. Now, there are some states that have state-based exchanges. However, Georgia is not proposing to create its own exchange. Georgia is just proposing to just toss people out into the private market and having to deal with, you know, just insurance folks on their own. And so that is part of, you know, the concern people have about being able to move forward. We also have, you know, with folks being unemployed and then having to figure out and navigate how to get insurance on their own. So these are a lot of the concerns, like at least if we can have people who are willing to fight for a better system while making sure the stopgap that was put in place actually works to the best extent possible. I mean, people understood that, I think, as a part of the rationale, but there definitely is, I think, an entry point. And so one of the beneficial things I think about all the organizing that's going on is like people continue to do that organizing post-election. These are all organizations that exist year round and continue to have these conversations. They're continue to have conversations around healthcare and other issues so that people can start being more informed and participating when there are sessions, you know, public comments and things of that nature moving forward, sharing their healthcare stories. I mean, that has been, I think, an effort to get people's stories out there so other folks, one, are cluing in and paying attention to. And I focus on healthcare because it's personally something that I have become more aware about through my own health concerns, but it is an effective organizing tool, having these conversations with people, but also directly connecting it to the politics, helping people understand who are the people specifically who make these decisions and how do we push them and activate them to moving forward.
The race got a lot of attention, or I shouldn't say got a lot of attention, but a big part of the narrative around the Georgia race, and I should say both Warnock and Ossoff, as well as Biden, a lot of the narrative dealt with Stacey Abrams' role, and then in a sort of macrocosmic way, on the national political stage, a lot of the narrative was about the role of Black women. If Stacey Abrams sort of embodied that in Georgia, the archetype was sort of a focus of the narrative about the national race. And to whatever extent you have thoughts about the bigger picture role of Black women in this race, in these races, in our politics, and Stacey Abrams specifically, I'm curious to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and what I appreciate about Stacey Abrams as someone who does the work that she does, is that even though, you know, she steps into these spaces and receives the praise, she's very clear about who else is in the room doing the work as well, right? Like she'll point to and name, other organizations, other leaders, et cetera. And, has used her platform, the organization she started, Fair Fight Action, uses its platform to help leverage and do work with other folks. But I think when we're talking about like nationally, I think back to, I want to say it was after Tom Perez came in as chair, there was a group of national Black women, I think Reverend Leah Daughtry was one of them, who wrote an open letter to him as the chair of the DNC about, respecting and honoring Black women and their political prowess within, Democratic politics, considering we are the largest consistent base of Democratic voters, right? Percentage-wise, like in terms of support overall, and then followed by Black men and so on going down. But what we have not seen necessarily translate to is like we get these Think Black Women and Trust Black Women, posts, et cetera. Something that was just recently covered in an article for News One was that, I was talking with the head of the Gwinnett County Democratic Party here, Bianca Keaton, and another strategist, Kimberlyn Carter, and they were just talking about, yes, celebrate Black women, that's great, but actually trust us in terms of strategy and vision. And when we talk about Stacey Abrams, everyone's focusing now on how brilliant she is and how this has been the long-term, trajectory that she's been working on and stuff, but with anyone that is a visionary or that is organizing to do something different, it is always a steep climb before people actually start to buy in, right? Because I remember just even going back to 2017, 2018, and the struggle even here internally within the party during that primary process to get people on board with the idea of, heavily investing in a massive organizing effort around the entire state. There was an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and some other, coverage about her burn rate. And, for folks who may not be familiar, like if you're, when you're running a campaign, the burn rate is the rate which, you're spending money. And she did have a high burn rate. She also had a really high fundraising rate, but she was spending a lot of money from earlier on because she was hiring up, they were investing, they were doing a tour around, we have 159 counties in the state of Georgia. And, that was something that she valued. I mean, it's the same thing when you look at some of the grassroots organizations, Black Voters Matter, has a massive operation and works, primarily in the southern part of the state and has a big network with the buses and the fleet of vans, but also empowering and working with local community leaders. So these are, I think it's a challenge in terms of what do we value. It's great, the words and the people use the phrase, give them their flowers, so to speak, but at the same time, actually listen to people when it's time at the outset to develop the strategy for a campaign, trust people to lead, their own teams and things of that nature. And we're talking about like just the architect, but I think it's not just Black women, right? I mean, we are a very particular set with a very clear set of documented grievances. But when we look at the way in which we choose to, or who we choose to elevate in these political spaces, whether they're candidates, whether they're people on campaign staff, strategists, I mean, consultants, right? There is still this skew towards a particular, I'm not going to just say all white men, it's a particular type, white man. I mean, why Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod still have, the grip on the national political pulse that they do, despite all of the issues with.
They're incredibly smart, Anoa. I don't know if you've heard that. Incredibly smart.
I mean, yes, so smart indeed, but it is a very particular section. So, I mean, people talk about, decolonizing spaces or dismantling white supremacy and other concepts. When we look at, institutional politics, it's skewed a very particular way. There's a very particular mindset. There's a very particular playbook that unfortunately does not always work. And but for, the ingenuity, the hard work, the grit, the drive of so many different groups of people on the ground, and with Black women being, one that consistent voting bloc that they are, that's part of the push. But I think, something that some of my more radical friends will push back on and say is that, we collectively have to start making more demands instead of just showing up and hoping people recognize and support it on the back end, making sure that we are very clear with our demands up front. And I agree with that. And I think what we saw here in Georgia in particular, after the general election, when everyone was like, oh, wow, Georgia's in play. Yes, we've been telling you this for a couple of years now, that Georgia's in play. When people would start saying, well, Georgia needs to do this, or they need to run this way, or we saw this conversation happening nationally, and folks were like, wait a minute, we got us here. We're going to continue to push all the way. So that's self-determination, that making those clear demands that this is the way money needs to spend. I mean, that's still a work in progress. I'm not going to say that was a perfect, exchange with national entities and, folks here in the state. But at the same time, I think folks were very clear about drawing the line, and we're going to run campaigns on our own terms. So you saw people, the Latino outreach that happened here was phenomenal with Mahente and GLAR and several other
I didn't know
organizations.
that.
They ran, so by, I think it was the weekend, by the end of GOTV weekend ahead of Election Day, they had called every Latino eligible voter in the state. I think Asian Americans Advancing Justice is something similar, and they ran, support and work in multiple different languages, and were able to advocate to get language assistance, for some folks ahead of the election. So there was a lot that happened, but that investment and, folks, will recognize that there was a larger multiracial effort, but people recognize the initial organizing and a lot of the hard work that were put in by, Black organizers. I mean, go back to folks like Helen Butler, who runs the Georgia's Agenda for the People's, I always mess up, it's such a long name organization, but Helen Butler is an amazing organizer. And I'm going to bite myself later for forgetting it's a long name organization, but like Reverend Joseph Lowry, like there's so many amazing folks who have been doing this work historically. Reverend Warnock comes out of Martin Luther King's church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, and that has such a huge social justice history of its own in organizing spaces too. So that was something that people have been tapping into for a long time, but that energy, that commitment has spread out to so many other groups who are also doing this work. So we see, Mahente and other folks doing work in language, tapping local artists, tapping local musicians. There's actually a Spanish version of, Ray Charles's Georgia that was amazing to listen to. And so these are things that people were doing to get people excited and engaged and talking about the issues and stuff. And it happened in a really amazing way. So I think when we're talking about, trust Black women or Black women's leadership or lifting up Black women, it is important and valuable, but I think ultimately what we're talking about is like self-determination in the political process and making sure that when people are, putting in work, that they're actually respected for that work, but also, for any of us who do any type of labor, compensated accordingly. But I also think that we need to be making very clear demands on what that looks like.
I have to say, I kind of, I lost focus on what you were saying for a moment there, because something you had previously said was really resonating, and I wanted to bounce it off you. And it's about what you had to say about trust Black women, and this may reflect my own sort of systemic inherent bias. But I guess when I've previously heard the term, the what it sounded like to me was a demand or a call that the people in power trust the judgment and the wisdom and the knowledge of Black women. And I guess what you had to say made me think I've been mishearing it, and that what it's about is that trust Black women to be in those positions to decide what to do. Right?
So I think it's a combination. Okay. And I think what you're saying is, and so, to think back to 2017 during Netroots and here in Atlanta, leading, being a part of a disruption that had to chant "Trust Black Women." Like part of that, I think it's multiple levels, right? I mean, and that had to do with Stacey Abrams' opponent in the primary, Stacey Evans, speaking at Netroots on the stage, and folks took it to be something that was done in support of Stacey Abrams. I mean, I myself actually wasn't even a supporter of hers, had not had a stake in the governor's race or anything like that at the time. The issue for us had to do more around like education, and some of the women that were in the room protesting were education advocates and organizers themselves. And you had I think she was vice president of the NEA at the time, Becky Pringle, coming on stage immediately after Stacey Evans, and Stacey Evans had backed some, education choice issues that were a problem and that were not being properly discussed and addressed. And so thinking back to that moment and thinking about the use of that chant, like I agree with what you were saying, like it had to do with like people's judgment, knowledge, experience. But also, I think part of trusting people's knowledge, judgment, and experience when we're talking about in the political context, like directly in terms of like when you were asking about Stacey Abrams, when we're thinking about like people's vision, like, because she's being praised for her vision, right? Black women will be praised for the way in which they show up and do things, because we just, and it's not just Black women to do this. I mean, all of us probably have this somewhere in us, because there's somebody's grandma who taught them about how to just make it work somewhere at some point in time. But part of that has to do with just making sure that it's great. You like it now that we won and it's good for you. Well, move out the way and let people continue to do their work, right? There are all these different barriers, or, you know, things that are put in the way that actually, you know, obstruct the ability of Black women and other folks, particularly other women of color, to be able to step into these roles. So it's also, I think, for a lot of us, like who really sat around and talked and have thought through this, it's not just that just because someone's a Black woman then automatically you have to do whatever they say, just move out the way. There might be some people who that's what they think and that's what they approve of, and that's fine too. But there is an experience, there is a political, I think, persona or personal philosophy that folks are like connecting to, that are identifying and saying like, hey, these are people that have a particular experience. And so, yeah, so I'm not going to say that just because someone's a Black woman, like this is also a trap, right? Like, I think the idea behind the phrase initially was trusting people with their own intuition and their experiences, and understanding that people have a lived experience that is important and needs to be recognized and honored. However, when we're talking about in these moments of like leadership opportunities, like instead of just waiting for us to do all the work and make sure that you win, I mean, like folks look at the way South Carolina, Black voters basically saved Joe Biden's campaign, right? But the idea is not that, oh, yay, that's so wonderful, Black people just showed up, Black voters save America. We see these headlines all the time. That's cool. But instead, you could actually recognize, support, invest in, and engage people on the front end, instead of waiting people who are just trying to save themselves and inadvertently save you too, and then say thank you in the end, right? Like, so I think that's really more of what it is. It's just like actually recognizing the potential, the leadership, the vision, the strategic planning and understanding. I mean, we look at folks like Nsé Ufot, who is a colleague and friend, who is the CEO of the New Georgia Project. She can very clearly talk to folks about how the struggle it has been over the last several years to get people to understand what is being built and happening here in Georgia, but it had been dismissed of. I mean, largely because a lot of this organizing has been led by Black and other women of color. I think if it was more coming from, even if it was white progressives actually doing this organizing, I think there might have been a little bit more seriousness taken to it a little bit earlier than what we ultimately saw by the time we're getting around to election time. So yeah, like I think when we're talking about trusting Black women, like it's also just allowing people their own individual self-determination and personal authority to like be very clear about what are, the standards, or not the standards, but what are the steps that they are taking to move whatever agenda it is that they're forward. Again, it doesn't mean that you can't object someone just because, but at the same time, it's like recognizing that we do, unfortunately, in a lot of instances, have these built-in biases that would not permit Black women to be in particular positions without having to fight like everybody across the board to be able to get there.
I wonder if you think, because this is another thought that came to me out of what you were saying, was it sounds like there's an element to this of if you recognize the fact that Black women in this sphere that we're talking about are capable of getting things done, the corollary to that means paying attention to what they have to say when they say, because I can get things done, you should trust me when I say this other thing is also doable, right? This thing that you've said is not politically doable. I'm a get things done person, so I'm telling you, and listen to me, trust Black women, that's doable. That Georgia voting blue on the presidential and ultimately both Senate seats for 6 years, that's doable. That a lot of white people, I'm sure, around the country, and I was very skeptical myself that Georgia was going to be a victory for either of those three people. So is that part of it, or am I
Yeah, I
reading
think
too
what
much
it
into it?
is I think there's also like just internal to a lot of these conversations about politics in particular. It's internal to these conversations that particular people's opinions matter more. Or particular people's insights matter
Right,
more, right?
right.
Like, or their particular, the data points without context, right? Like we even seen this after the general election. People were talking about, oh, there were these major wins in the suburbs, so white suburban people gave Biden a victory, without actually drilling down and looking at the demographics. And what we know, living here in Metro Atlanta, is that the suburbs are extremely diverse. Gwinnett County, I referenced earlier, has been one of the most rapidly diversifying counties, of the last decade. So there are all these different shifts that we're seeing in areas that have a good degree of diversity within, their population. But people weren't necessarily like trying to listen to that, because the conventional traditional wisdom, which has been, put in place mostly by white men of a particular age and political persuasion, is what you have to neatly follow and address. And just here in Georgia and a lot of other places, there's this idea that you have to carry, I mean, just even thinking about the presidential election cycle, you have to carry a particular percentage of white voters. You have to appeal to a certain number of moderate voters to be able to win, when that's not the framing. And I think, there's a lot of investment. I mean, there are entire, whether it's media, whether it's ad companies, whether it's, the various polling companies and folks who like to, predict the election stuff. There's an entire ecosystem that is built on a particular way of approaching politics. So folks are heavily invested in rejecting or not listening to when people bring to them an alternative scenario that may not sound plausible or believable, because it doesn't exist in their worldview, right? And so I'm not going to say that, of course, the evidence has always shown that Georgia was a slam dunk. I mean, this was a lot of hard work, but you have a lot of people who have been working for a long time. And I don't think that we have an effective measure in the way, mainstream political coverage happens, to look at how long-term base building works, right? We look at individual cycles of elections, but we don't necessarily look at the cumulative effect of turning people out, right? So like, with Stacey Abrams closed that gap, statewide gap, to like 50,000 votes. And, if you believe that 50,000 votes was fair, whatever the other stuff around the voter suppression, all things that happened with Kemp, but like the gap shrunk astronomically in comparison, to the prior instances of statewide elections. When you just look at the turnout and participation in this election compared to 2014, when Natalie Nunn and Jason Carter ran, it's such a different dynamic because of the investment in engaging and turning out voters. But you also have a lot of these organizations that do this work, recognizing that municipal election years, legislative cycles,
Yep.
like these are things that are also important. So people have also rejected the notion of off cycles, right? I think Nina Turner and other folks, I don't know if Nina coined this, but I know she's the person I first heard it from, probably back in 2016 or 2017, that there is no off cycle, right? We're always on. And so that
I
is the
keep telling
mentality.
people, I'm sorry to interrupt. I keep telling people, election day isn't the Super Bowl, it's draft day. That's when you
Exactly.
get to work.
Absolutely. Election day. I mean, folks may want to sleep a day, but yes,
Yes.
absolutely. Absolutely. Like the
Yeah.
way we act like it's a final point when it's not, right? Like it's simply, it's a
Right.
mere inflection point in the overall, civic engagement process. And there are these other ways that we engage and we still connect with people. And so we do see organizations, some of the national digital based organizations, understand that and do that too, but it's really different when you're on the actual ground with the communities that you're trying to activate. And so when we're just thinking about like how that shift has happened and seeing what happened here, I mean, you also have in Reverend Warnock, someone who has been very, connected to a lot of this work, whether it's around voting rights, whether it's around criminal justice. I remember when I was on staff in New Georgia Project last year, they had a national convening. I Another thing with a really long name, like organizers really love their really long, convoluted names for things sometimes.
Well, you're
And it's
very
kind of
generous with the shout outs, so you're uniquely vulnerable to messing them up.
I am. But there was a conference called the initial part was Let My People Go. And so it was a multi-faith convening at Ebenezer Baptist Church. So they brought together imams, people of faith, people of conscience, for those of us who may not belong to an organized religion, rabbis. It was an amazing 3-day event around criminal justice reform and all the different aspects, ending mass incarceration. And that type of organizing is what we've seen, him in his capacity as the senior, the leading reverend at that church has done. Like I mentioned before, they have a social justice ministry. But so we've seen that type of work, and it's been like all over the state, right? And, John Ossoff built up the support that he did when he had the special election run. And there were some concerns. So I know a lot of folks nationally looked at it and thought, yes, Ossoff, it was bad. The Reverend, he's not Stacey Abrams, right? The problem was here on the ground, our perspective was the Reverend is going to do this. We're not sure if John can carry the state.
Yeah.
And also because he was able to carry pretty much a district. That's one district in terms of an entire state, and building up the apparatus. And both of them, with their individual campaigns, made decisions and did what they did, but they recognized going into the general election the importance of running as more of a ticket, so to speak. Treating those two seats as a ticket, because that was more beneficial and also helped people understand what was at stake with the Senate. The one thing that I think is a little disappointing, and there are several different things that I'm sure folks will dig into over the next several weeks and months about this, is we had a third race that didn't really get any coverage. We had a Public Service Commission race, and for folks not familiar, I actually just learned a whole lot about the Public Service Commission this election. But the Public Service Commission, deals with utility rates. We have some of the highest utility bills in the country, broadband expansion and things of that nature. And so the candidate in that race, Daniel Blackman, the Democrat, who's also a Black man, there was a larger gap in terms of his race, in terms of the drop off of voters. So folks, there's a drop off when you go down ballot.
They don't bother. Yeah.
People don't go all the way down. We only had 3 races, and folks are like, well, we only had 3 races. But for some people, if they don't know anything about a race, they don't even try, right? They don't want to guess. They don't know if they're going to get it wrong. And so unfortunately, because there wasn't the same effort behind the Senate candidates, and definitely understand people's thinking about the importance and value of the Senate, absolutely. But at the same time, we did have this really important statewide election that did not get the same, outreach and support necessarily, but they still ran, a great campaign statewide. So it's those types of things that people need to think through. There are also some issues of, just talking to folks anecdotally yesterday about the coordinated campaign and differences between federal campaigns and state campaigns with funding and things of that nature as well. So, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the average person. They don't know that.
How come I can give this much to that guy, but only this much to the...
And we don't have straight ticket voting. So it's not like you can just say, vote just straight Dem. People, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And you have people, apparently, because we're not a state that necessarily requires people to declare their parties, we have people, anecdote from what people say, we have people who cross back and forth sometimes too. So it is really interesting, like just thinking about the difference in, the overwhelming turnout we saw with the Senate races and then this other state level race that we had. But I do think that the one thing that is clear is that folks have made the case for how we can build multiracial coalitions that are strong on issues. And I'm not going to say that, there are some things that I disagree with issue-based wise with both the Reverend and, John Ossoff. However, we have seen folks take stronger progressive stances on some issues that I think traditional logic for a Senate race would say you shouldn't even do that. And we saw them still win. I mean, they also had all the other things going on with the president and these 2 corrupt candidates that were in their favor. But that organizing and connecting with people and getting them energized about a Senate race was, I think, something that folks knew was possible to do.
When you talk about them, I would say it's probably fair to say both of them running campaigns that, even if progressives might not be happy with the entirety of both their platforms, I think it's fair to concede that the campaigns they ran and the personas that they put out and the rhetoric that they used was more progressive than most people would assume would be the way to go to win in Georgia in a statewide race. And you alluded earlier to people on the national political spectrum essentially coming in after people in the state made this look possible, and people nationally coming in and saying, okay, now that you got us this far, here's what you need to do. And people going, no, 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 no. And I'm kind of wondering, what were some of the specifics that you got that the campaigns or the state organizers were told by the DNC or anyone else, whether it's pundits or the actual party, saying, you guys should be doing this? And the answer was, no, we should not.
I mean, well, one of the clear things, and again, not speaking on behalf on any candidate's campaign or organization, but one of the clear things that we have seen happening wasn't just even, I mean, same thing that happened in Stacey's campaign too, was, you need to recruit, you need to go after Republicans, you need to make sure you don't lose white voters. I mean, that's a constant refrain we keep hearing. And I think we do have a coalition here, right? We have a coalition with, liberal leaning white people. We have, Black voters, other voters of color. We have Asian American voters are like the fastest growing voting population in the country. And we have a good growing population here in the state as well. So making sure we were tapping into, like, if you know your base, like, because Republicans don't do this, right? Republicans don't waste time trying to convince Democrats that you should vote for me because I'm a better candidate. They know their base, they know what works, they just go do it. And they also might try to get you to stay home and not support the candidate that is quote unquote on your side, but they know their base, they know their candidates, and that's what they do. And so organizers here, they know the general communities that they want to target. They know the general issues that are relevant to those communities. And they know that because they've been already talking to people for the past couple of years, because they do this work all the time. So it's not just voter registration work that people are doing. They're also asking, they're also doing issue spotting, asking people like, what are some of the issues of concern? They're having, smaller meetings with people. I mean, so they know, they have some data already, about concerns when issues are already coming up. I mean, one of the things that we saw happening this year, obviously with the protests and, the demand that has risen up around defunding police. So that was another thing, right? In particular, because especially going into the runoff election, because people were blaming the demand for defund police for certain losses, when it's like, I don't know that other candidates had the level of vitriol and racism in ads against them that Reverend Warnock did, right? Of the candidates that claimed that defund police was what, made them lose their campaigns, and not probably just like their own poor strategy and not doing the right outreach. But when we look at, the commercials that were being run against Reverend Warnock, and my kids would actually call me into the room like, did you see this? Like, this is hilarious. He wants to let everyone out of the jails. Like, it was just so blatant and direct. And, I mean, not just what we've seen covered with the commercial, the ad that darkened his skin several shades. I mean, there were all types of stuff. There were commercials where the one that really caught me that was very just blatant was a white woman wearing all white in an all white kitchen talking about balance. And I was like, they want to bring balance to the force like Anakin. Like, it was a very wild experience watching it happen. So, one thing that I know had kind of like bothered me and some other folks was there was a Warnock commercial that was like a bunch of different law enforcement officers talking about like, no, he doesn't want to defund police. We've worked with him and and all that stuff. And I was like, I understand why y'all are doing this strategically, but maybe this is not, maybe make sure it doesn't run for certain demographics or in certain areas or whatever. And so, but they felt they needed to.
Can you elaborate on that? Maybe it doesn't run with, what did you mean? Maybe it doesn't run with who?
I mean, because we also are in a moment right now, because we're literally in a moment right now where people are directly oppositional and having issues and concerns with the way in which the police, law enforcement, and the state are engaging with Black people, Black lives, and in particular Black men. So maybe if we're trying to increase and engage and turn people out, you don't run this commercial, on certain stations or channels or whatever. Now with some of the like cable channel, you can't always
Tailor
avoid
it
that.
that, yeah.
Yeah, you can't always
But
avoid that, but
is
it
the
was,
con-
no, go
is the
ahead.
concern though that it's an attempt to try to tamp down the fears of white suburbanites that no, he's not going to let people out of prison, and that by doing that it risks dampening the enthusiasm of his base
So there
by
was a
by
concern that it could be a question. I mean, it was a concern that, yes, like trying to make sure that people like understood that he wasn't, because it was a balancing act, right? Because granted, the accusations being made against him in terms of how he basically hates the police, hates the military, for some folks, they're like, that's what's up, that's cool.
right.
But at the same time, I
Right,
mean, at the same time, like he did have this commercial with some, I think it was a couple
right,
of sheriffs and some other folks,
yeah,
and they were just sharing anecdotes about the work they've done with him. But it's
yeah,
not inconsistent with anything he's ever said about the way he has done his
right,
work, right? So it wasn't
right.
necessarily inauthentic to the Reverend, but just
Understood.
strategically thinking about that type of commercial as a response. The concern was also in part like, how do we make sure that people understand what is happening in the broader scale? So it's not like he's double talking, because you didn't want people to take away that perspective either, right?
Yeah,
Like you want to make sure that, I mean, he gave an answer around defund that was, I think, strategic. The way it wasn't that he was supportive of defund, but he also does support like reform and all these other issues. He does support ending cash bail and things of that nature. So like he walked his line that he needed to walk for this race. But I think the concern was with these two commercials was that they would just get in this mode of trying to appease and make sure they wouldn't lose certain people versus the outreach and engagement people were doing to bring people on board. And so I think that was like a concern that was happening. But also, it's not like, some of the organizations, especially if you're running IEs, independent expenditures and things of that nature, you can't talk to the campaign and say, hey, can you not do that because you're messing up our outreach? Like you can't have those conversations either. But it's a growing process and working through. So, I mean, obviously, people like, again, like I saw the commercial and I was just like, I get it. Like I understand why this exists. Like I see the other commercials, so I know. And that's the other thing, right? So people would see the other commercials. So a
yeah,
lot of people figured it out. But when that was happening, though, you did have nationally, people were like, you need to reject this and people need to shut this down and not do that. So that's
right,
actually something that he's never done, which was
yeah,
also respected by
yeah,
folks. So it's like, we don't agree on this strategy, but at the same time, we have a respectful disagreement about what the strategy should be, but at the same time, you do understand how people are moving and how we can collaborate where it's possible. So I mean, those are two things. But I also think just even the focus on the ad spending, which is what we see in a lot of these major races, right? Because that's where certain people
right,
make their money, is on
yes,
ads versus actually investing in organizers to work on the doors or whatever. So we did see organizations that had huge, it was interesting to see people, and I had mixed feelings about this considering we're still in the pandemic, but we did see large scale canvassing operations return, and I do think that was beneficial. I mean, thankfully, folks were also very careful as possible, making sure their staff had PPE, making sure folks understood the importance of not just when they were on shift, but even in their own, I mean, you can't necessarily control people's personal lives and interactions, but just encouraging folks to make sure they were, taking all the precautions and restrictions as possible, so that if we are on doors, that we're not impacting people negatively. And so that was actually something. My brother actually was a canvas leader with Work and Families Party, and so just watching him, kind of walk through some of that stuff with his canvassers was also really interesting to see, like how much emphasis folks were were putting on making sure people stayed safe and also made sure they were having safe interactions. But knocking on doors, the texting, and I know the texting drove a lot of people nuts, but we did see this really large direct communication happening. And I think that there is just this idea that people who do national campaigns, if they worked on presidential campaigns, if they've done things, that somehow they know more or they're better equipped at certain things. But like folks here in Georgia, they know their terrain. So we saw organizations, who might have helped do some of the outreach in Southwest Georgia, going in and bringing resources with them, but at the same time, making sure that they were listening to local organizers, because they're the ones that know which churches you need to go to, or who you need to talk to, and things of that nature. They know, maybe this business might be more amenable to supporting you than this one. So, I mean, that stuff makes
that guy can turn out 500 people.
Right. And that one is going to say they will, but they're not really going to show they have you. That type of thing, right? Like, so, I mean, that might seem like salt potatoes to some folks, but that really can make or break what's happening. And we saw a lot of that collective small organizing that come together and really shift things on a broad scale. I think, especially when we got to this runoff election.
So before we go, I want to ask you one last question looking forward, which is, we talked about how there's no such thing, or you talked about how there's no such thing as the off cycle. In terms of tomorrow, metaphorically and literally, people who want things, constituents, voters, people who live in this country, who want things, who want certain performance and action and progress from Raphael Warnock, from John Ossoff, from Joe Biden, what's the plan? How do you go about doing that, especially in an age where I think that anyone being critical of a Democratic politician now gets instantly slammed with, oh, you must love Trump instead, right? When it's quite the opposite. So what does that look like if you don't believe in the off cycle and you want to make sure that the two senators and the new president are all doing what they campaigned on, and hopefully even better? What does that organizing look like? What does that future look like?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, because that's really how we need to shift. I think one thing with us in terms of progressives, the left, like, we're very quick to well, you did something, you said something, you tweeted something wrong, that's it. In terms of, especially with candidates and elected officials, it's like, you said what? Okay, we're done with you, that's it. And I think, how do we be strategic in the organizing in between these election cycles? Part of what I just had a conversation with Representative Renita Shannon, just thinking about, she's a state rep here in Georgia, thinking about this upcoming legislative cycle. The legislative cycle happens here starts here on Monday, and it's unclear if it's going to extend the full regular period or if they're going to take a break because of the pandemic. But we know one thing is first up on the chopping block is absentee ballot use here in the state, right? And so people are thinking about, like, how do we mobilize and address what we need to address with the local, the statewide legislative issues that we have? Like, who do we need to lean on that's on our side, so to speak? And then who do we need to still mobilize? Who can we at least get to maybe just vote present instead of voting, yes, yay or nay, in terms of state legislature? But then also, what are the agendas, like, what are the things nationally that we need to be thinking about? So that coalition work that I think that happens nationally, there are a lot of organizations that are national organizations that are basically coalitions of state and local organizations. So Center for Popular Democracy has a really large network of organizing folks. I think People's Action is another one that has a large organization, but it's mostly a lot of networks of local organizations as well that are thinking, go ahead.
Yeah, I do want to interrupt you for a second, because it sounds like you're saying, because my sort of hidebound model of how do you affect change is like direct one-on-one pressure on your elected representatives, senators, president, whatever, letting them know, I want you to do this, I want you to do that. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is that, because I asked you, like, how do you move those guys?
Individuals. Mm-hmm.
Individuals. And your answer, really interestingly to me, which is why I wanted to interrupt you, because I sort of wanted to, like, bookmark what you said. Your answer, it sounded like to me, was saying it's less about getting that particular piece on the chessboard to move where you want it, and more about activating and awakening people around the issues at stake. And I'm asking you a twofold question. One, is that roughly right? And two, is the idea that the natural sort of physics consequence of that is that the politics and the politicians have to follow suit?
Yeah, so I think what your summary, I think, is about right. Just thinking about like, how do we create the pressure points to push people forward on these issues? So like us as constituents pushing these two senators, like, yes, that's important. But if they're in chambers, if they have, something else that's pushing on them, because unfortunately we're not all there with them, right, in DC, in Congress. So when you have these larger collective efforts, let's say we're trying to push for a vote on a particular issue, but it's if there's a larger coordinated effort, so it's not just us pushing our individual senators, but you have this larger effort of folks pushing their senators as well, that you have a critical mass that is representing, whatever base or block of voters that it represents. And people will respond to that, because what it is that we have this power struggle where it's us fighting, whatever special interests are backing other issues that are appearing in Congress. And those lobbyists, special interests, they can't afford to be physically there, right? Like, so they don't need to have thousands and thousands of people, signatures on, petitions and things of that nature. It's literally them with whatever cash they have in hand that can move whatever they need to move forward. So how people, like, if we're trying to push for particular issues, if we're trying to really move people, it is a local organizing, like us statewide collectively pushing, our two senators where we need to push them. But at the same time as being in coalition on these, since they're a federal body, there are things that are federal issues that are going to impact people across multiple states. So that collective and being able to point to all these different groups of people all over the place and saying that, hey, we're representing the best interests of, multiple groups of people, I think puts people in a stronger position in terms of that advocacy. Because one thing we talk about in terms of holding people accountable, part of being able to hold people accountable is being able to show up in with your full force and let them know, like, hi, here are the people who gave you this, who put you here. This is what we're trying to do. But then we can magnify that impact when we are also a part of this larger, broader network of people who are also pushing and saying the same thing. So I think we see a lot of that coalition work happening. The conversation folks have had around, demanding the vote around the medical, Medicare for all. Part of, what some folks who do that more congressional organizing are saying is like, yeah, we need to have this coalition work. We need to be putting pressure, but we need to be very clear on what we're asking people, who we're asking, and how we're moving things forward. And so I think that more of that is going to start happening. I think we're going to see more people, because folks have seen how we got to this point. People are understanding that we don't ever want to get here again. We're not out of this, but we don't want to come back to this again, right? Yeah. So people are understanding that they need to be more consistently involved and being involved, whether it's dealing with our congressional folks or dealing with our state reps, that we need to have these, present processes where we're pulling people together and pushing on certain issues.
Anything else you want to weigh in on before we go on anything we've talked about or anything else?
No, I just really appreciate you for having the conversation, and encourage folks, if you like what I had to say, then make sure you follow me along on social media at The Way with Anoa, or you can catch my podcast, The Way with Anoa, at thewaywithanoa.com. I'm consistent and on brand. So yeah.
I like that. I'm consistent and on brand. So I definitely encourage anyone who's interested in your work. You've been an organizer and a reporter, and as you just said, you have a podcast. It's thewaywithanoa.com. That's ANOA, thewaywithanoa.com, and find her on Twitter and everywhere else, and follow her as I do, and get what you can from her insights and everything else. Anoa, thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Okay, take care, and everyone out there, take care of each other, take care of yourselves. Bye now.